Welcome to the Gamer's Encyclopedia, an informative series detailing the histories of long-running or important series in gaming history. Today I want to talk about the Breath of Fire series. Breath of Fire was a series of Japanese RPGs made by Capcom, and while it seems mostly to be forgotten today, for a while it was a huge favorite of mine. Each game is its own story, but there are some tenuous connections between them, mostly thematic ones. There's always a blue-haired swordsman named Ryu who can turn into a dragon, and there's always a blonde winged woman named Nina who always uses magic. Beyond that, almost anything goes, and the final main entry in the series would be really weird and taking it a totally different direction. But I've played and enjoyed all of these, and it's sort of a damn shame that Capcom has let the series die out completely. There hasn't been a new entry in this series since the PlayStation 2 days. The only things after that were spin-offs, and even they were mostly crappy, all on mobile phones and all in Japan. But it's a series worth looking into, so let's just do that. Let's take a look at the original game. Here's the vital stats. Breath of Fire, in Japan, is called Breath of Fire the Dragon Warrior. It was developed and published by Capcom, though in the US it was published by Square. More on that in a little bit. It was produced by Tokuro Fujiwaka. It was released for the Super NES in Japan on April 3, 1993, and in America on August 10, 1994. The original Super NES version did not come out in Europe. Years later, it was brought to the Game Boy Advance with a few enhancements. This one was self-published by Capcom in America and Japan, and published by Ubisoft in Europe. The Game Boy Advance version came out in Japan on June 6, 2001, in America on December 13, 2001, and in Europe on December 14, 2001. For game rankings, I'm going with the Game Boy Advance version because it's the higher one. It has a rating of 75.94, the fourth highest in the series. Breath of Fire was created by Capcom, but Squaresoft came in when they wanted to localize the game to the United States. Capcom had made mostly action titles up until that point, and had very little experience localizing and translating games like Breath of Fire, which by their standards had a lot of text. So they called in the most experienced at translating RPGs, Squaresoft, makers of the Final Fantasy series. Square put their head translator, Ted Woolsey, on it, and he did, well, his usual hatchet job. It's kind of funny. Back then he was actually kind of famous for translating a lot of Square games, most of which were considered classics. But you look at his work now by today's standards, and you just wonder what the guy was smoking. Breath of Fire was full of errors in spelling and grammar and inconsistencies in the translation, and for some reason a lot of changes were made to the names of characters. Some I could sort of understand since English text takes up a lot more space than Japanese, so they had to shorten things. Like, for example, the character Judas became Jade. They had to try to keep it to 4-letter words. But some changes didn't make much sense. For example, the character Dees became Blue, which has the same amount of characters. Who knows? Breath of Fire has you playing as Ryu, the warrior of a light dragon tribe. The dragon tribes are human-like characters who can also turn into dragons, and they split into two ages ago and had a huge war. The light dragons lost their powers, but the dark dragons either don't know or don't care, and they attack their village. During the opening sequence, Ryu's sister Sarah turns everybody to stone and fights Jade, or Judas, or whatever, on her own, but loses and is captured by the dark dragons. The villagers eventually turn back from stone, and Ryu sets out to rescue his sister and defeat the dark dragon Emperor Zog, and along the way meets a very strange cast of characters who join him, each of which turns out to be based on a different animal, and each character not only has different abilities in battle, but different abilities on the overworld. For example, one character can turn to a bird and fly the party around, another can punch down weak walls, another can open locked doors. It gives the game a lot of variety. The game had nice, colorful Capcom-style graphics done by Keiji Inafune, the creator of Mega Man. And you can see a lot of similarities. One boss even looks almost exactly like Stone Man from Mega Man 5. Here's an interesting bit of trivia. There was a documentary that came with the GameCube version of Mega Man Anniversary Collection. It may have also been in the Xbox version, I'm not sure. It's definitely not in the PlayStation 2 version. They only got an episode of the crappy Mega Man cartoon show. Talk about getting the shaft. Anyway, in the documentary, Inafune is talking about how the design of Mega Man characters has evolved, and he's flipping randomly through old sketchbooks where he first drew concept art for characters. And there's a whole part where he's flipping through a notebook without looking at it, and he's talking about Mega Man, but all the characters are from Breath of Fire. Breath of Fire was a fairly successful game, and I remember getting it as a gift and having a lot of fun with it. Enough so that when I saw the sequel in a store a while later, I picked it up without question. So let's talk about that sequel. Here's the vital stats. Breath of Fire 2, known in Japan as Breath of Fire 2 The Destined Child, was developed by Capcom and also published by them in Japan and America, while the European version was published by Laguna. The game was directed by Yoshinori Kawano and produced by Tokuro Fujiwara. The game was released for the Super NES in Japan on December 2, 1994, in America on December 10, 1995, and in Europe on April 25, 1996. It was later released for the Game Boy Advance in Japan on December 21, 2001, in America on April 16, 2002, and in Europe on June 28, 2002. The European Game Boy Advance version was published by Ubisoft. Breath of Fire 2 is also on the Wii Virtual Console, the only game in the series to be on there. That version got released in Japan on June 26, 2007, in Europe on August 10, 2008, and in America on August 27, 2007. The game ranking score, based on the Super NES version, is 76.25, the third highest in the series. Breath of Fire 2 is, in a lot of ways, a huge improvement over the first game, pretty much addressing all of the first game's faults. It's longer, it's more challenging, and it has better graphics and music, though the sound quality of the music seems worse than in the original. The game was also translated by Capcom themselves this time around, though they kept a lot of the same alternate names that Squaresoft had used. I thought this might have been for consistency, but the third game would revert the names back to the Japanese ones for the most part. However, Capcom still wasn't very savvy with translating, and the game once again has a lot of errors in spelling and grammar, perhaps more than the first game, and it still has inconsistencies such as characters randomly changing names. The game takes place a few hundred years after the first, and there's a new Ryu and a new Nina, and other than that, a whole new cast of characters, though one of the characters from the first game could be added as a secret character. Breath of Fire 2 also has a lot of religious references in it. The main villain is a demon called Death Evans, who is posing as a god and the head of the Church of Saint Eva, which seems to bear a striking similarity to the Catholic Church. It's honestly a wonder they got away with this on a Nintendo console in the mid-90s, as it's pretty blatantly anti-Catholic. The demon is feeding off of people's prayers. The more powerful it gets, the more demons it sets out to cause problems in the world. The more problems, the more people turn to religion, which only strengthens him. What makes the game interesting is there's a bit of complexity to it. There are some characters that are part of the church, but are not necessarily evil and are unaware of what's going on. Ryu starts off in a village living with his father, who is a preacher in the Saint Eva Church, and his sister. One day his sister goes missing, and he has to chase her down and bring her back. But when he gets back to the village, his father and his sister are both gone, and nobody remembers who he is. He hooks up with a young boy named Bao, who looks like a dog, and they set off where they are quickly attacked by a powerful demon. It then goes to years later, and Ryu and Bao are working as rangers, solving people's problems, and soon Bao gets framed for burglary, and in the process of clearing his name, you also find out about the invasion of demons and set out to find the source of evil in the world. When I was a kid, I was used to RPGs that had fairly simple plots. Usually it was as simple as an evil wizard or an evil empire. It was all very cut and dry. But Breath of Fire 2 was one of the first that I remember to be rather complex. Though due to the limited nature of the Super NES and the poor translation, a bit of imagination was required to fill in some gaps. Breath of Fire 2 is even better than the first game, and I highly recommend it. The only problem is the game is pretty hard, and I do mean really hard. I recommend you try it for Game Boy Advance, which aside from being a bit enhanced, has enemies giving you double the amount of money and experience from battles. What's funny is this doesn't make the game easy, it's still a challenge, just not nearly as bad. I remember talking to someone who was playing it, and he said it was a pretty challenging game, and I mentioned how the experience and the money were doubled in the Game Boy Advance version, and he was shocked. He felt like it wasn't enough as it is, so imagining half of that was blowing his mind. Breath of Fire 3 would next show up on the PlayStation, and I have to say that this, along with Castlevania, were the reasons that I got the system. Anyway, let's take a look. Breath of Fire 3 was developed and published by Capcom. It was directed by Makoto Ikehara and produced by Yoshinori Takanaka and Hironobu Takeshita. It was released on PlayStation in Japan on September 11, 1997, in America on April 30, 1998, and in Europe on October 8, 1998. It was later released for PlayStation Portable in Japan on August 25, 2005, and in Europe on February 3, 2006. The PSP version was not released in America due to the policy that Sony had about ports of 2D games. You couldn't have a port of a 2D game on a Sony console in America unless it had a certain amount of new content, and as this only had a few extras, it was disallowed in America. Weak, but as the PSP is region-free and the European version is in English, a quick trip to eBay works. That's what I did. For game rankings, it has a rating of 73.75, the lowest in the series. Now, don't let the game ranking score fool you. I personally don't get how it turned out to be the lowest, as this is my favorite in the series. This time, it's another few hundred years later, and dragons are thought to be completely extinct, mostly wiped away in a war ages ago because they supposedly tried to take over the world. Some familiar-looking miners are mining for chrism, an ore that comes from the fossilized remains of magical creatures such as dragons, and they find a baby dragon embedded in some chrism that is still alive, and it attacks them and goes on a rampage. This baby dragon is the main character Ryu, who after escaping from the mine winds up falling in with two other boys, Rei and Tipo, who mostly make a living through petty crimes, though they do help people out in a nearby village when pushed into it. Eventually, they get the wrong kind of attention and are attacked by mafia members, and Ryu only survives due to him being a dragon, and for the first half of the game you're on the run from the mob, who eventually captures you and makes you fight in a tournament, where you meet Gar, a guardian who fought in Dragon Wars, who believes that all dragons are evil. However, when he sees how powerful Ryu is, he realizes that the Guardians only won the war because the dragons didn't really fight back. So he starts to question the orders of his boss, who told him that all the dragons need to be eliminated. Oh, and his boss? His boss is God. Yeah, once again, there's a lot of religious themes in this game. You spend the second half of the game literally searching for God, to find out why she, yes that's right, she, had the dragons wiped out. Breath of Fire 3 went 3D, but it still used 2D sprites, which I think looked great, and it had some cool graphics for spell effects and whatnot, and the soundtrack was really unusual. While the first two games used mostly symphonic classical stuff like most RPGs, Breath of Fire 3 relied heavily on jazz music, which seems like it would be weird, but it worked well for the game. Kind of like another Capcom title, Marvel vs. Capcom 2. Seems like there's just a few people at Capcom who are really into jazz. There's also a new system for turning into a dragon. In the first game, you gain spells to turn into dragons through certain side quests, and you use them to turn into a dragon form for an entire battle. In the second game, you used all of your magic at once to turn into a dragon and give you one single attack. In 3, you have dragon genes that you find and collect. Some are gotten as part of the story, but some you have to search for, and you can mix and match up to 3 genes to make a different dragon form, and you stay in the form, losing ability points every round until you run out and turn back, or choose to turn back yourself. This game is also a bit more serious than most games at the time. While the series always was a bit darker and more serious than other RPGs, it is a bit jarring in the first half, as these mafia guys are clearly out to straight up murder a group of children in cold blood, and then the second half deals with a god who condemned an entire species to death. Breath of Fire 3 is a great game that I can't recommend enough. If you guys remember my top 10 RPGs list from like a million years ago, you'll remember it made my top 10 back then. Despite the fact that Breath of Fire 3 got somewhat overshadowed by other games, such as Final Fantasy VII, it did well enough to continue the series, so let's take a look at the next one. Breath of Fire 4, or in Japan, it has a really weird title that's very hard to translate, but the closest I can come is Breath of Fire 4 The Unfading Ones. It was developed and published by Capcom, and the PC port was published by Source Next. It was directed by Makoto Ikehara. The original PlayStation version was released in Japan on April 28, 2000, in America on November 28, 2000, and in Europe on August 3, 2001. The PC version came out in Japan on May 30, 2003, and in Europe on September 10, 2003. The PC version did not come to America, though I can imagine the European version would work fine. It's also available on the PlayStation Network, in which it came out in Japan on June 6, 2011, and in America on August 16, 2011. You can play it on PlayStation 3, PlayStation Portable, or PlayStation Vita. The game ranking score is 81.85, the highest in the series. This one is interesting because it was a highly anticipated game for me, and I remember when I got it, I was both elated with how great it was, but also slightly disappointed by it at the same time. I felt that even though the game improved on Breath of Fire 3 in most ways, such as graphics, music, and story, there were aspects of the gameplay that I preferred in 3. But that's not to knock this one. This is one of those games that is really sort of underrated and forgotten. It came out around the same time as Final Fantasy IX did, and was sort of lost in the crossfire. But I played the hell out of this one. This game has very little connection to the first 3, though some fans choose to see it as being a prequel to the series. I prefer to think of it as unconnected. This game deals with a dragon god named Fo Lu, who formed an empire years ago and ruled for many years, but then became tired of humanity and put himself to sleep. He awakened centuries later looking to reclaim his throne, but he's split into 2 people. One is Fo Lu, the emperor, and the other is Ryu, who is an amnesiac. Ryu is taken in by Nina, who along with her friend Cray is on a mission to find her older sister, who went missing on a diplomatic mission to the Empire in the West. The Empire sees Fo Lu as a threat because he wants to reclaim his throne, and they covet Ryu's power. The Alliance, who are opposed to the Empire and currently are in a ceasefire with them, have issues with what Nina's doing because she's shaking up the politics by going to the Empire illegally, and they send a mercenary to keep an eye on her. This one is dark, political, and at times absolutely gut-wrenching. All of the things it got right. The biggest was the story, which is dark, tragic, and is about the folly of man wanting to become like a god. Possibly the most horrific part of the whole series is the Hex Cannon from 4, a weapon of mass destruction that the Empire uses to destroy entire cities and makes them uninhabitable for many years. A hexed city can't even be walked through without protective equipment. You can't help but think of nuclear weapons, but to fire the Hex Cannon they need a human sacrifice that has to be tortured nearly to death before being sacrificed to the Hex, so that their negative emotions can power the weapon. So basically, it's a gigantic gun that shoots weaponized sorrow. It's a pretty sickening concept, and when one of the familiar, likable characters is sacrificed to it, it leads to another character completely losing his mind and becoming the villain. I could talk all day about this one, but I don't got all day, so let's move on. Obviously, after how good 3 and 4 were, I couldn't wait to see where the series would go next. And I think I'm not alone in saying that I was shocked at the odd twist Capcom would give with the next one. So let's take a look. Breath of Fire 5 Dragon Quarter, sold in America and Europe without the number in the title, was developed by Capcom Production Studio 3 and published by Capcom. It was directed by Makoto Ikehara. Breath of Fire 5 was released only for the PlayStation 2. It came out in Japan on November 14, 2002, in America on February 16, 2003, and in Europe on November 28, 2003. The game ranking score is 78.22, the second highest of the series. Breath of Fire 5 is a really, really strange game for its time, though I think it aged pretty well, and it might seem pretty familiar to modern RPG fans. Just taking a look at it, you see a 3D game with cel-shaded graphics, a dark, gritty, and futuristic science fiction setting, and an unusual battle system that puts a lot of focus on setting and using traps, and is somehow action-based, but at the same time is also turn-based. Yeah. Breath of Fire 5 also has a really weird way of telling the story, as you have limited continues. If you die, you can either use one of those continues if you have one and go back to the last save point, or you could choose to start the game over. If you start the game over, you're back to level 1, but you keep all the items you found. Experience is also handled differently. You get experience from battles, of course, but you also get party experience, which you can give to characters at your leisure. The party experience carries over when you restart, and this game is really difficult. So a valid technique is to never use the party experience and play until it gets too hard, and then restart. Do this a few times, and you'll have a load of party experience saved up to start yourself off at a much higher level. Starting over also adds new cutscenes and fleshes out the storyline, and there are certain doors that may only open after you've restarted a certain amount of times or met other criteria that are done through restarting. There's also the D counter. In this game, Ryu is slowly becoming overcome by the soul of a dragon, and this is done through a counter at the top of the screen which ticks up at a very slow rate. Anytime you use any dragon abilities, it goes up faster, and if it reaches 100 before the last boss, the game ends. So you're forced to conserve the dragon abilities, but at times you may need them to get you out of a pinch. The game is also very linear for an RPG. It revolves much more around telling the story than exploration. I think this game is the reason that I like Final Fantasy XIII so much. That game seemed very familiar to me after having played Breath of Fire 5. In the story, you play as a ranger named Ryu who has a very low D ratio. The D ratio was once the odds of a person bonding with the soul of a dragon, but the meaning behind it is mostly forgotten, and it's become a form of social status instead. A war ages ago made the surface of the planet so polluted that people had to retreat underground, but due to how the mining and the internal pollution, it's a shitty world, and the lower you are from the surface, the worse it is. Ryu starts off very, very deep below the surface. The object is to get to the surface, which may be livable by now, as it's been centuries. Nina in this game is a bioengineered creature that is made to purify the air, but the air is so dirty she's dying, and getting her to the surface is her only hope of survival. Your only other party member is Lynn, a resistance fighter who just wants to oppose the government any way she can. This game got really mixed reviews when it came out because of how strange it was, and a lot of fans of the series felt alienated by it. It was nothing like the previous 4 games, and most people passed it up. However, as you can tell from the game ranking score, it is a decent game. You just have to think of it as its own thing, and not as part of the Breath of Fire series. Yes, it's this weird action RPG hybrid, it's linear, it has very little fantasy elements, and is mostly a science fiction story, but it's a damn fine game that got overlooked. Unfortunately, it also killed the series. Breath of Fire 5 may have been good, but due to it alienating the fanbase, it sold badly, and Capcom pulled the plug on any plans to release a Breath of Fire 6. Every once in a while you hear rumors about Breath of Fire 6, but it always turns out to be just rumors. What's interesting is that there are indeed a lot of fans who want to see the series return, and many Capcom employees have expressed their interest in working on a new one, but Capcom has no interest, it seems. Lately, Operation Rainfall has been trying to drum up support for a new Breath of Fire game, and I wish them success, but it just seems like one of those things that's just not coming back. Even other developers, such as Camelot, have offered to make Breath of Fire games, but Capcom has just said thanks, but no thanks. Well, there are a few spin-offs to talk about, but don't get excited. Like I said earlier, they're all in Japan only, they're all on mobile devices, and for the most part, not so great. Breath of Grand Millionaire is a Japanese gambling game that uses characters from Breath of Fire 4. It was released in Japan only for mobile phones in August of 2003. Beyond that, I have almost no information on it at all. Grand Millionaire is one of those card games that really only caught on in Japan and has a very simple premise, but of course is complicated to master. The game is so Japanese that its rules were said to originate from a manga. So, yeah, you could play cards on your cell phone with some Breath of Fire 4 art slapped all over it, whoop-de-doo. Breath of Fire Dragon Fisherman is exactly the sort of thing you might expect. It was released in Japan on mobile phones on October 15, 2005. Fishing has always been a big part of the series, or at least the first 4 games, but especially 3 and 4. This is basically the fishing game from 4 extracted from the game and put on a cell phone. This strikes me as weird because the fishing in 4 was kinda ass-related. It plays like a rhythm game. The much more popular and insanely addictive fishing minigame from Breath of Fire 3 should have been the one to be released, but if you manage to get the PSP version of 3, it has the fishing game separately with some specific challenges, so there's always that. Breath of Fire, the Sword of Fire, and the Magic of Wind is a very simplistic action RPG that is a spin-off of Breath of Fire 4, with only Ryu and Nina as characters. You can switch between them on the fly and attack with Ryu's sword or dragon attacks or Nina's magic. It was released in Japan on Docomo phones on November of 2008, and then for AU and SoftBank phones sometime after that. What's interesting is that usually mobile games are for specific devices like iOS or Android, but in this case it was for specific carriers, which is just damn weird. The last spin-off is a sequel to the last one, Breath of Fire 4, The Fairies and the Key of Light. This one was released for Docomo phones in Japan on November of 2008, and for other carriers the next year. When I heard the title of this one, I thought it might have something to do with the Fairy Village building side quest in 4, but although it uses the Fairy Village as a setting, it's another action RPG like the last one. Yeah. Well, that's the last we heard of Breath of Fire so far, but hopefully Capcom will get their heads out of their asses eventually and realize that they have other IPs than Street Fighter and Resident Evil. You know, stuff like Breath of Fire and Mega Man that they seem to have completely abandoned. Hell, I'd settle for a new Beautiful Joe. Throw me a bone here. I used to be one of the biggest Capcom fans ever, and now I just want to tell them to swirl my sack in their mouth like red wine. Oh well. That's it for this episode of the Gamer's Encyclopedia. I think next week we'll talk about another RPG series, though instead of a Japanese one, we'll talk about an American one. And instead of a dead series that is all but forgotten, we'll talk about a lively one that gets people excited like crazy. Yeah, be there.